Absolute surrender is the requirement for worship. If you want to worship God, you've got to get to the place where you surrender over to him. Now, I want to be real with you. This is your pastor who loves you, who's trying to work with you and help you. Sometimes you find that there are limits to your worship. I get it. We all have limits to your worship. Sorry, to our worship. To your worship. That's funny. We all have limits to our worship, and anybody who tells you differently is lying. We struggle. There are always things that pop up in our life that challenge us to value something else other than God. It happens. So don't disqualify yourself. Don't discourage yourself, but don't stay in that position. As your pastor, let me encourage you, get out of that position. God has so much more for you. Well, how do you get out of that position? Great question. The way that you do it is by taking those things and surrendering them to God, being real with him in a relationship that goes beyond just showing up in a building, a relationship that can talk to God and say, God, this is what's going on in my life. That's what we call in the church confession. It's not a little box with some guy on the other side who's doing who knows what, all right? That's not confession. Confession is us in relationship with God, bringing forth our weaknesses, bringing forth our problems. You know, the author of Romans, he had some problems, probably with his eyesight. We don't really know. But he went before the Lord 3 times. Like, God, get this thing off of me. It's a hindrance. It's a weakness. And the Lord's like, I know. And that's why my grace is sufficient. And Paul learned, oh my goodness, I get to boast in my weaknesses. He came to the point where he was even able to handle his weaknesses by giving them over to the Lord. And then God used his weaknesses to show his power. So Paul even thought his weaknesses, which were a hindrance, were the end. But God showed him, no, that's just the beginning. You hand it over to me, and I will give you what you need. Does it make sense why Paul is appealing to you to offer your life as a living sacrifice? I know absolute surrender seems terrifying, but that's real worship. And what's even better for you to understand is when you see what hinders that worship and you can be honest with God and say, God, here are the things that are hindering me in worship. Can you fix them? That's even better. Because that's bringing you to the place where you will never look down your nose at somebody else because you're so great. Yep. Why can't you surrender? I did. Why can't you get up to the altar? I did. The Lord shows you that every one of us has battles. And when we bring those battles before the Lord, not gloating in them, that's huge. We're not saying, oh man, yeah, this is my battle. You know, recognize it and honor my battle. Forget that. No, we're bringing it before the Lord saying, I know that this is a problem. Humbly. And God begins to give us what we need to overcome that. Your worship will never be richer than when God gives you victories over things that you knew were holding you back. You will get to a place where you realize that with God, all things are possible. And you will find yourself rejoicing that you even had those problems, because without those problems, you would have never leaned on God, because in your pride, you thought you could do it on your own. But then when you brought them before the Lord, you realized, I have nothing but grace. And God says, good, because I have grace for you. And that grace gets you through. All of a sudden, you will rejoice, because God is so good to not leave you in that position of failure and not leave you in that past of destruction, but to love you enough to say, I recognize that. I'm glad you do too. Let's work on it. Here's my Holy Spirit. And he begins to work on it. Now, don't think it's going to be fun all the time. Sometimes it's irritating. Sometimes it's just grueling. Sometimes it's great. But the key to all of it is faithfulness. Faithfulness, allowing God to be consistent in dealing with those things.